If it wasn't clear enough in my video on Warrior's Refuge, I've been really enjoying the first series of mangas centered around Graystripe, Millie, and their quest to find ThunderClan once again. However, I'll say now that I really do not like this book nearly as much as I like the sweet little tale of the lost warrior, let alone the everlasting cuteness that is Warrior's Refuge. Graystripe's character in these mangas never matched that of the main series, but this book's portrayal of him contradicts even its own previous works and is genuinely uncomfortable to read at points, especially knowing how previous entries handled their relationship and how Millie reacts to it all. Warrior's Return was released on April 22nd of 2008, 4 months after both Warrior's Refuge and Dark River, and on the same day as Outcast. 4 months to complete a book is already a rapid turnaround, but making a graphic novel in that time frame is ridiculously impressive. As with the previous 2 entries, Warrior's Return was written by Dan Jolie and illustrated by James L. Barry, who I must assume was either working on 2 manga entries at once or did not get much sleep for those 4 months. Also, as with the other 2 entries in this series, this book begins with an anonymous Aaron Hunter's note, this time giving a mild refresher on the last book's content and mostly asking probing questions to engage the reader and get them excited about where Graystripe's journey may lead, now that he is finally faced with the prospect of following the clans to their new home. Unlike the last 2 entries, though, Warrior's Return only has a distinct speaking cast of 11 cats, a drop by 5, and unsurprisingly, the percentage of the lines in the top 5 cats went up substantially, from 85% to 96%. And even the cat with the 5th most lines in the book, Barley, only speaks 6 times. Even with these statistics, though, it's nice to note that Graystripe and Millie's line counts have evened out a bit for this book, with Millie having over 100 lines for the first time, so that she seems on par with Graystripe, who also has more lines in this manga than either of the previous ones. Now, without further ado, let's see how Graystripe's adventure ends. When last we left off, Graystripe had just located the Great Sycamore, one of the last recognizable elements of his old home, and also one of the last trees left standing in ThunderClan territory. Though he had found where his home used to be, that home itself and the cats in it were gone. Now he sadly walks through what used to be his camp and, resting in the medicine den, tells Millie more about the clans. When he wakes up the next morning, she has already decided that they're going to look for his clan. Graystripe assumed that they were all taken like he was, but Millie wants him to be certain before he gives up. And with Millie's hopes and Graystripe's memories, they decide to keep going, past the sundrown place that the traveling group from the New Prophecy talked about. First, though, they visit and see what has become of each clan's territory, and soon enough they find Ravenpaw and Barley at their barn, who explain what happened to Firestar and the rest of the clans, along with the general direction they went. Graystripe and Millie spend the night in the barn, where Millie gets a chance to demonstrate how talented she has become before they set off. As they're leaving, we get a very sweet little moment where Barley asks if Ravenpaw is okay, and Ravenpaw says that he is, but that Graystripe was the last connection he had to the forest, and now that is gone too. Graystripe and Millie begin traveling, first through a dense two-leg place with some mean two-legs and messy sewers, and then towards the outskirts, where there is a house surrounded by grass and a tree with a tire swing, much closer to where Millie came from. Because they are hungry, Millie wants to take the opportunity to get some food from inside, which Graystripe is, shall we say, less than receptive to. He gets very angry with her for even suggesting it, because clan cats hunt, they aren't kitty pets. Millie is perturbed, but doesn't argue further. The next day, they reach a fenced-in flock of sheep, and Graystripe wants to go through them. Millie asks why they couldn't just walk around, and Graystripe gives 2 responses. First, that it would take too long, and second, that going Millie's way would require walking on a 2-leg path. It is the second response that Millie takes issue with, as it seems that anything even related to 2 legs has now become off-limits. Millie points out that he didn't take this much issue with 2 legs when he was a kitty pet himself, and Graystripe says he was wrong, and he needs to correct his behavior now that he's once again dedicated to being a warrior. Millie, once again, reluctantly agrees and takes Graystripe's way through the sheep, who promptly run them over as soon as the herding dogs show up. Graystripe and Millie are now hungry and nearly died. This makes Millie even more mad, and Graystripe decides to just leave rather than responding, and in his head comments on how he can't back down now because it might mean losing sight of what a warrior is again. They arrive at a truck stop, a place that disturbs Graystripe because of the excess of monsters, and find a cat there who is unfortunately asleep at that moment. Spotting a cat flap in the main building, Millie decides on her own to go in and get some food, and despite Graystripe's continued protests, she goes in anyway and leaves him to mope on his own. After she comes out, having eaten her fill, Graystripe finally agrees to go in and get something to eat, but is hit and chased out with a mop before he can get a single bite in. Millie genuinely apologizes since she had no idea that would happen, and Graystripe absolutely blows up at her, not only calling her idea, kitty pet food, or the two-leg place worthless, but telling Millie that he should have known her idea would be a bad one because she's still a kitty pet, not a warrior, and she should return to her comfy house instead of facing the real world with him. Millie tries to calm him down, and as he turns around to insult her one last time, a car hits Graystripe and sends him flying. Despite everything he just said, Millie immediately leaps in to save him, and the cat we saw sleeping earlier, Diesel, as he calls himself, helps as well. They get him into the odd barn, the garage, and Diesel gives him a mouse for breakfast. While Graystripe was asleep, Millie asked Diesel if he had seen any clan cats, which he hadn't. But he does know where the Sundrown place is, or as he calls it, the sea. Grumpy Graystripe tries to leave right away, but his leg is still very hurt, and Diesel teasingly taps him in the head area to show how much he needs rest. Diesel also notices how amazing Millie is at hunting and tells Graystripe he's lucky to have her. Graystripe says he doesn't feel particularly lucky. Graystripe keeps feeling left out as Millie teaches and spends time with Diesel, and he is left behind because he needs to rest. The only time he spends with Millie alone is when she's taking care of him. After an undetermined time skip, he finally decides to try talking to her. The three cats are sitting on top of the truck stop, and Diesel points out one monster that's coming from the sea. He can tell because of the salt and fish smells, and the colors and sounds from the monster have changed. Millie asks if Diesel would ever want to go to the sea himself, but he's happy there. That night, Millie brings Graystripe a mouse. He says he has gotten better and could hunt for himself, and Millie says she knows, but likes being able to do things for him. Graystripe then makes an attempt at confessing what we can assume are his feelings for her, and is cut off by Millie suggesting they should ride a monster to the sea, a faster route that would put less strain on his shoulder, which, of course, shocks and terrifies Graystripe. But Diesel shows up to explain that they discussed this already, and he thinks it would work. Knowing Millie discussed it with Diesel before him only makes him angrier, and he once again blows up at her, asking rhetorically if she understands how dangerous monsters are, which Millie does. Of course she does. She was a kitty pet. But knowing the risks, she wanted to take that chance for him. Despite this, Graystripe walks away without giving an answer again and broods about how the two legs destroyed his way of life, and wonders if going back to the clans on a monster would be spitting on the warrior code. By the next morning, though, he has decided to go along with their plan. Diesel picks out a monster heading towards the sea, and, with difficulty, Millie and Graystripe hop in the truck, and Graystripe tries to contain his sickness as they ride along. They spend a night in a parking lot while the two legs are in an inn, and get attacked by some kitty pets, who hate wildcats as much as Graystripe suddenly hates kitty pets. Even Millie saying she was a kitty pet isn't enough to dissuade them, as she now carries the smell of wilderness. They fight them off, but Graystripe's shoulder is hurt again, and their monster starts to leave, with them barely catching it in time. They reach the Sundrown place and start searching for where Firestar would have gone next, asking a random cat in the woods about the clans along the way, before coming upon the lake. Then, seeing the full moon above, Graystripe pauses and asks Millie to speak before they go down. He explains that he knows he's been hard to deal with and that being a warrior is difficult, but Millie has helped him so much and he never would have gotten there without her. He asks her to be his mate, and Millie says that's what she's always wanted. They walk in quiet harmony down to the island and, on the other side, find Firestar and the rest of the cats who make up his home. So, I did my genuine best to contain my emotions during the summary portion this time. Let's, get the good stuff out of the way first, because this isn't as bad as, say, Outcast. I think some of the most standout moments were actually at the very beginning and very end of this novel. The opening camp scene I'm currently drawing a page of was genuinely heart-wrenching. We see all of these different little places, intimately familiar to Graystripe and familiar to us through the words of the first arc, and they've all been abandoned, run down, or destroyed. Graystripe's narration tells us of each place he recognizes, but he says nothing aloud. And the only dialogue is Millie saying she is sorry before he goes into rest and grieve in the medicine den, the only piece of his home that was left standing. It's a powerful, emotional scene carried by the ability to show expressions and body language rather than describing everything. The very last scene is similar, if we are able to completely ignore the context of everything else that has happened in this book. Graystripe pausing just before he gets everything he's been searching for to verbally explain and thank Millie for all she has done for him and ask if they could be together forever is extremely heartwarming, and certainly succeeds at one of the arc's two overall goals of showing us how Graystripe found his new mate he showed up with in the site. Again, ignoring the middle of the book, their relationship has easily been one of the best and most developed parts of this manga series, and the ability for them to just walk in a contented, harmonious silence as they approach the gathering is a show of how close and how strong of a pair they have become. Also, and on a much less significant note, seeing Ravenpaw and Barley again was a real treat. A lot of their short time in this book was devoted to exposition, so Graystripe and Millie would have any idea of where to go, but in the very end, as Barley notices something is wrong and checks in on Ravenpaw, who is quietly disappointed at seeing the last vestige of his old home leave, we get a sliver of their care for each other and Ravenpaw's complex feelings about the clans. It's very brief, but realistic and sweet. Okay, I think we need to talk about Graystripe's behavior in this book now. First off, as I've been saying since The Lost Warrior, the Graystripe depicted in the mangas is not the same cat and doesn't have the same whims, personality, or motives as the Graystripe seen in the main series. Manga Graystripe has always been grumpy, quick to give up, slow to trust, and a careful, rational decision-maker, where the first arc depicted him as lighthearted, determined, quick to put his trust in anyone, and pretty impulsive, tugged by his emotional heartstrings wherever he went. Manga Graystripe sometimes gets desperate around things that are important and emotionally driven for him, most notably returning to Firestar and the clans at large, but for the most part he seems much more logical and careful than the first arc's Graystripe could ever hope to be. He was also, notably, kind. He cared for Millie, he cared for Husker and their family of barn cats, he even cared for the two-legs he lived with and the two-leg kit he saved. Even if he wasn't comfortable around all of them at first, he saw them in need at different points and chose to help all of them, and be helped in return. This key feature is what has most made his story a joy to read, and it is completely absent for the majority of this book. Now, I'll admit that this isn't helped by the world that he is put into. Unlike in both previous manga entries, there are no nice two-legs or cats in need to work with, help, or be helped by. Every two-leg he meets finds him a nuisance and drives him away, and every cat they meet, save for Diesel, is either terrified of them or attacks them immediately. This choice certainly makes their journey feel more desperate and dangerous, but it also loses the charm that the first two books had, and Graystripe himself isn't much better. As soon as he gets it in his mind, from Millie's reminder that he can't give up on ThunderClan, he becomes hyper-focused on a clan-first attitude and on getting to the clans both as quickly and as, for lack of a better term, purely as possible. He now feels revulsion at anything having to do with two-legs or kitty pets, or anything not proper for a clan cat, which includes harshly turning down safer and more efficient routes suggested by Millie and sulking off instead of explaining himself, leaving her to follow along with his own plan. Even beyond that, he is often cruel, lashes out at her, gets jealous very easily as soon as Diesel shows up, despite nothing really happening between them, and generally treats Millie horribly through this whole story. Easily the worst was just before he got hit by the car, when he called her idea, and her, worthless, and said she should just head back home to her two-legs since she doesn't care about him or the clans. Let's remind ourselves that this is Graystripe, the cat who barely shared a scrap with Rusty, the kitty pet, before deciding he was a cool guy and they should talk instead. Let's remind ourselves that this is Graystripe, the cat whose supposed strongest quality was his loyalty to those he cared about. Let's remind ourselves that this is Graystripe, the cat who, in just the last book, had realized how strong, talented, brave, and worthwhile Millie was and had grown to deeply care for and trust her. Let's now ask ourselves if that person, either of those people, would repeatedly lash out with such cruelty at someone he cared for here. Actually, let's not ask. He just wouldn't. Even worse, though, is that Millie's reactions haven't changed since the first two books. For the most part, she is still acting like she's traveling with the slightly grumpy, sometimes pessimistic, but overall kind, determined, methodical cat that she met in the two-leg place. She only gets mad at him for brief moments before getting over it and continuing to follow him anyway. And most of the time she doesn't even respond to his tantrums with anything other than silence or a glare. Then, in the end, when Graystripe confesses his feelings, she says she has always loved him and doesn't even bring up any resentment or worry about the way he's been treating her in this book specifically. It just feels like they don't understand how badly Graystripe was behaving here, which is unfortunately a fairly common issue in Warriors at large, often in regards to their male characters. Warrior's Return is an unfortunately poor way to end this otherwise nice series, and honestly, the difference in quality and characterization between this manga and the previous is one of the reasons I find it difficult to talk about Graystripe's adventure as a whole later on, when it is reprinted as one book. Whether it's because of the extremely short period they were given to make Warrior's Return, a change in editing decisions, or any other reason, it's still horrible to see the balanced, sweet relationship between two strong, defined, kind-hearted characters from the last two books made into this right at the end. I overall have very mixed feelings about this manga series as a whole, but I can pretty definitively say that this book in particular wasn't an enjoyable read. But it is over, and the only impact now will likely be in how Graystripe and Millie's relationship is treated in the background. We'll just have to see which incarnation of their relationship the main series chooses to stick with when we return to Power of Three in the next episode of our trip through time.